As I mentioned in that interview, attacks by Afghan forces against their supposed Western allies have been increasing. You can imagine how difficult it is for Australian soldiers to operate in that environment. To discuss the challenges, I was joined in the studio by James Brown, an Australian Army officer who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, now a military fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy. James Brown, how can Australian troops function effectively in Afghanistan when they fear attacks from the Afghan forces that they're training?
It's very difficult for them to do that. I mean, part of the role involves trust. They're mentoring other Afghans, they're mentoring them in very close ways, in very small bases. They need to have their implicit trust, and the kind of arrangements that have been brought in to guard against these kind of attacks make developing that trust very difficult. So for them to keep doing their job, it's going to be very difficult indeed. Is
there anything that commanders can do to help them do their job, but also to protect them from further incidents like this?
What they're now starting to do as a result of the attacks over the last 2 years is segregate their living quarters, give them space where they can be away from Afghan soldiers for at least part of the day so that they're not on constant guard for 24 hours, which can be very draining. And they're also starting to use soldiers as guardian angels. So whenever Afghans and Australians are interacting in training, they'll have an Australian off to the side with a weapon, watching what's happening, ready to respond if necessary.
But then that must be very hard to elicit the Afghans' trust, because they must feel every second like someone's watching them and thinking they're about to attack.
It's very hard to say, we trust you to take over security for the people in this province, and then have someone watching over them with a weapon at the same time.
The Australian government says that Australia will stay in Afghanistan until we finish this mission. Are the goals of this mission properly defined?
The goals have been lowered over the last decade since Afghanistan has been underway. The Australian government's goal now is to train the Afghans in Afghanistan to a standard where they can conduct independent operations. They'll meet that standard by the time our troops leave, but that standard is a long way below what we said we were going to do a number of years ago.
And presumably that's pretty subjective, assessing if they've met this standard.
There are certain measures, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to involve a certain amount of confidence on the part of Australian trainers that they won't be able to gauge before we leave. We can gauge whether they can get logistics out to their troops in the field, whether they can command independent operations, but whether they can actually continue fighting with vigour, take the fight to the Taliban after we leave, is going to be a matter of faith.
The Australian government says that our involvement in Afghanistan is, among other things, about protecting Australia from terrorism. Is it?
Yes, I think it is. You've got to remember that this state was a state that issued passports to terrorists, where very impregnable valleys in southern Afghanistan could be used to generate tons of money from the drug trade. So yes, that argument's true, and one of the concerns we have is that once we move out of Afghanistan, that might happen again. To a certain extent, we're not going to know what happens in the south of Afghanistan. It's going to go dark to a certain extent once Western forces leave.
So then what's the value of staying there right now, if it's all going to go back how it was?
It's going to be a difficult challenge, and I think part of the reason Australian troops are there is to give it the best shot. It's not going to be a perfect solution, but they're going to get to a standard that they can achieve in a reasonable time frame, set by, above all things, politics, because this is a political mission above all else.
Is a political mission a good enough reason to risk Australian soldiers' lives?
Yes, I think we need to make decisions about how we use military force, and that involves risking our soldiers. And I think that's something in Australia that we've forgotten. We got so used to being able to deploy soldiers to places like Timor, even to places like Iraq, and to not suffer casualties. We were very lucky for a decade, and that luck's run out.
But presumably when leaders make decisions about missions, one of the things you have to take into account is, are the goals of the operation likely to be achieved, and therefore it's worth risking lives? Is that really the case here?
I don't think Australian leaders had an option not to respond to the challenge in Afghanistan back in 2005 and 2006. This was a place where there was horrific suffering amongst the civilian population, where women were seriously oppressed, and where there was a real terrorist threat to us. So not responding was not an option, and the only response that was going to have some sway was a military response.
James Brown, thank you very much.
No problem.